What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Christ in Capital, the show that wants to encourage you to love God, love neighbor, and build something. I'm the host, Dustin Johnson, and today is going to be fantastic. We are continuing a two-part series on theonomy and taxes. The first episode is going to be released on the Theonomoney podcast, which is a podcast whose host is my guest today. So his name is Jeremy Collins. Jeremy, thank you for joining me on the show.
Thanks for having me, Dustin.
So we did it wasn't really brief. It was actually kind of detailed discussion of theonomy on your podcast a little while ago. And we wanted to kind of, bring us into this discussion about taxation and why is taxation a good thing? Is it something that's prescribed by the Bible? That sort of thing. Can you just kind of give us a brief overview? Actually, no, you know what? Before we do that, let's do this. Introduce yourself to the audience. What's Theonomoney all about? How'd you get it started? Let's do that first.
Okay. Yeah. So like Dustin said, my name is Jeremy. Theonomoney is a podcast I started that is part of the Fill the Earth network from Cruciform Ministries. It is a network that we're trying to bring all sorts of different podcasts and blogs on board to fill the earth with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the seas. That's where the name Fill the Earth comes from. You can check that out at cruciformministries.org. And so we're wanting podcasts and blogs on all sorts of different topics. And one of them we wanted to have one on was economics. So that was kind of the inspiration to start Theonomoney, which the name is just a bit of a pun, a bit of a dad joke on theonomy and money. So that's kind of how it all started. And then last week with the part 1 episode on my podcast feed. And if you haven't gotten a chance to, go back and check that one out on Theonomoney. It's on all sorts of different podcast catchers, and I'm trying to constantly be getting it on more and more. So if you weren't able to catch up on that episode, then a brief summary of what we talked about is just what theonomy is, which it's the idea that the law of God is still applicable today, not in a sense that we need to be saved by keeping the law, not in a sense that we need to stay saved by keeping the law. I think Paul makes a good point in Romans 4 that even in the Old Testament, that's not how it was. Even then, they were saved by grace through faith. But theonomy is this idea that the Old Testament law teaches us how we should live and how we should govern the laws of our nations, not just the U.S., but any nation. Psalm 2 talks about how any nation, and the U.S. was not in existence yet when Psalm 2 was written thousands of years ago, how any nation that rebels against God will be crushed by Jesus, but those who take refuge in him will be blessed. So theonomy is this idea that God lays out in the Old Testament, specifically in the 10 Commandments, and then throughout the rest of the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, case laws of what applying the 10 Commandments looks like on a nation, in that case specifically the nation of Israel. And then we can look at those and see examples of how we apply God's law to any nation. And it doesn't have to be an exact one-for-one correlation. It can be a little bit more of the spirit of the law, the core truth the law is teaching, rather than that exact principle how it was laid out to Israel. Like the common example is the parapets on the roof. We don't hang out on a roof in America for the most part. Our climate and our culture isn't geared towards that. In ancient Israel, when air conditioning wasn't invented yet and it was very hot in the Middle East, people would go up on their flat roof and hang out up there. We don't do that with our slanted roofs that are designed to help snow not, wreck our house from its sheer weight and the rain runoff and all that. So we don't need roofs around. We don't need parapets or fences around our roof because no one's hanging out up there. But maybe if you have an in-ground pool, you would want to put a fence around your in-ground pool so the neighbor's kid doesn't try to jump into your pool and end up drowning or something like that.
Yep. Preservation of life.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll get into this later, but the idea of justice in the sense of remediation, reconciliation. God's law gives us principles. It gives us wisdom. It gives us, and some people use the term, we should be applying the general equity of the law, that it gives us a framework or a way to think about those laws. And so, yeah, I really encourage the listeners to go over to your podcast, subscribe, hit the notification bells, like all of that stuff.
Thank you.
But take a listen to that episode. It'll give you a really great rundown of theonomy and kind of the more nitty-gritty details of it. Not exhaustive by any means, but I think it'll give you a really good way of thinking about theonomy. So, but we did that episode so that we could have this discussion about taxation. I know taxation is a huge issue. Everyone thinks about it. Everyone has either issues with it, or they want it, or they have this love-hate relationship with it. And so we want to talk about it. What does God's law have to say about it? What does God's word have to say about it? And I think there are, just to kind of prime us, I think there are a couple ways that people look at taxation, or a couple ways that people have issues with taxation. So one of them is the question of whose jurisdiction, who gets to decide taxation, who gets the tax, right? Who gets to levy the tax? Who's the authority on taxation? That's one pain point. Two is how much. That's another thing. Like, is taxation too much? What's the quantity of taxation that's being requested? And then the other one is the method of taxation. Are we looking at a flat tax versus a progressive or a graduated system of sorts? And hopefully throughout this discussion, we'll touch on that, each of those. So just a quick spoiler, there is no good taxation. So, all right, we're done. Everyone log off. You've heard the episode. There really isn't a good form of taxation, but what we want to do is say, okay, well, let's take a look at God's law and let's see if a sinful society wants taxation, if they need taxation in the here and now, because we can't just cut it off like that. How can we work our way toward a no taxation situation without being sin, without breaking God's law? Well, I mean, without, I guess, in the best way possible. And so maybe that's a way that we want to think about it as we're talking through this episode. Did you want to say anything, Jeremy?
No, I think you're doing a good job so far.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So when we first discussed this, Jeremy, you brought up a specific passage that basically just was the first thing that came to your mind. What was that passage? Can you give us a little rundown of what was going through your mind when I kind of pitched this topic to you?
Yeah, are you talking about 1 Samuel 8 with Samuel? So 1 Samuel 8, Samuel is giving warnings to the nation of Israel because they're saying we want a human king. We don't just want God to be our king. They're maybe thinking it feels too mystic having God as our king. We want someone flesh and blood we can look at and see as our king. We want to be like the nations all around us. And then Samuel goes and he tells them all the reasons why they shouldn't do that, all the reasons why they should continue with the system of judges that they had before. And while the book of Judges describes a lot of horrible things Israel did, that wasn't the goal of the period of the judges. The goal of the period of the judges was Israel to be righteous, and it was through their own hard-heartedness that all the terrible things in the book of Judges happened. But then when Samuel's talking to them, this is what happened. So we see, starting in verse 10, Samuel says, "So Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord to the people who had asked of him a king. He said, 'This will be the procedure of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of fifties, and some to do his plowing and to reap his harvest and to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will also take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. He will take a tenth of your seed and of your vineyards and give to his officers and to his servants. He will also take your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his works. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his servants. Then you will cry out in that day because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day.'" And then after that, it says that the people refused to listen to these warnings of Samuel and said, nevertheless, basically, we don't care that all these things are going to happen. We still want a king. And the main point with this is all the injustice that will happen from this king. He will take a tenth of your things in taxes. Like, that's so horrible that Samuel's saying they would take a
10%.
tenth. Yeah. We're in America looking at what, like a third, something like that, at
Yeah.
least a quarter for a lot of
Yeah.
people.
Mm-hmm.
And the
Yeah.
reason this tenth is so significant is the tenth, the tithe, is basically God's tax rate. That's what Abraham gave to Melchizedek after he defeated the people that had taken Sodom captive and had taken Lot and all of them captive. He gave a tenth, that tithe, to Melchizedek.
Mm-hmm.
So that tithe is like God's tax. It's like a religious tax type
Yeah.
of thing. So when the king or Caesar or the civil magistrate, whatever term you want to call, when he says that he's taking a tenth for himself, he's saying God's tithe is for me. And basically he's saying I'm God, because he's saying I get God's tax rate. And so
Yeah.
in a way, sorry, go ahead. Are you going to say something?
No, keep going.
Okay, yeah. So when we have a nation like the United States, and really probably most of the nations on the planet, taking more than a tithe, multiple tithes out of people's income, that's like them saying, I'm greater than God. I'm going to take multiple times God's tax rate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it gets to the point, as I mentioned earlier, it gets to the point of jurisdiction. It's the authority. Whose tax is it? Who has the authority to levy these things? And so that passage, as a little side trail, so I grew up in a Southern Baptist, background. That was kind of my context as I was growing up. And anytime you talk about taxation, this passage, the First Samuel passage, is always brought up as like, the 10%. You gauge taxation rates and political discussions about taxation based on that 10%, right? And for a good reason, right? We want to get wisdom from this passage. So that's kind of one of the key passages that people go to talk about this whole 10% threshold or benchmark. And one thing that I wanted to point out from this passage is that when it talks about all these terrible things that this king is going to do when Israel chooses this king, a lot of these things are reminiscent of things that our government does today, right? That's one thing I noted. The other thing was that when it talks about him taking the tenth of your grain, that whole piece is talking about something specific, right? It says the tenth. It's a definite article referencing something specific. It's not a general a tenth of this, like as in it's like an arbitrary amount. He's referencing something specific, and what he's referencing is this this tenth or tithe that's referenced throughout the first 5 books, specifically Exodus and Deuteronomy. And it's the tenth of your grain. I think the passage that we have pulled up is Deuteronomy 14:22. And so here's kind of the passage that they're pulling that from. So just take a listen to this. Deuteronomy 14:22. Be sure to set aside a tenth of all that your fields produce each year. Eat the tithe of your grain, new wine and olive oil, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks in the presence of the Lord your God, at the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always. So you've got this specific amount, the increase of your produce each year, a tenth of that is going to be given, and it's going to be used for the purposes of eating that grain, new wine, olive oil, firstborn of your herds and flocks in the presence of the Lord, where he tells you to, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God. So there's this kind of like church ecclesiastical purpose to it. The reason that we're setting this aside is for, festive worship, revering the Lord. That's the purpose. Later on, it goes down and it says, and do not neglect the Levites living in your towns, for they have no allotment or inheritance of their own. At the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithes of that year's produce and store it in your towns, so that the Levites, who have no allotment or inheritance of their own, and the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns may come and eat and be satisfied, and so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. So I guess some of the things that I wanted to point out from this. So this is the passage that's being referenced in, or this is the tenth that's being referenced in the First Samuel passage. And one of the things I want to point out from this passage is that, first of all, 10%, like Jeremy, like you were saying earlier, 10%. It seems super low, but this is where it's prescribed. 10%. That's the amount. It's on an equivalent to an income, right? It's not on wealth. It's not on property. It's on the increase of your produce each year. Okay. Third, it's used for local purposes or close to home reasons. So like I was saying, celebrations, festivals, for the widows and the orphans that are in your land, for the Levites who are your priests, or your I think of it as like your church, your elders, right? Your pastors, your elders. And not for, like, for us, it's not meant to be collected and distributed to far off lands where you never see the benefits of those things. It's for your community. It's for the people in your land, the orphans and the widows and the Levites that you're in community with. That's who it's for. Some people are going to ask, isn't care for the orphans and the widows a welfare function? Yes, it is. But it's not a civil government responsibility. So I think that's the thing that we're gonna kind of harp on throughout this episode, is that it's not the responsibility of the civil government to do this. This is an ecclesiastical function. It is something that is meant for community, for your church, for the priesthood, caring for the orphan and the widows near you. And Jeremy, I don't know if we could do this right now, just based on time, but the spheres of government, or the spheres of authority. Can you just give us a brief rundown? Why is that important? And how does that tie in here?
Yeah, I'll give a brief summary of it. I actually just released an episode of my podcast. By the time we release this, it'll probably be a week or two ago. And it was on kind of this idea of spheres of authority and welfare, and Caesar being, the argument that I was responding to was this argument that Caesar needs to be generous to the poor because God commands everyone to do so, and therefore Caesar needs to do it by welfare raised from taxes. And I was showing how that was a wrong argument. And one of the points was this idea of spheres of authority, that there are 3 spheres of authority, 4 if you count self-government, but the main 3 people go with are they go with first family government. So the father is the head of the household. He has authority for both the success and the failure, or he has responsibility for the success and the failure of his family. Then you have the church government, where the elders are the ones with authority here. And then you have the state, and the state, as Romans 13 tells us, is the minister of the sword. They are the ones who execute judgment on the wrongdoer. When someone breaks some sort of law, when someone is a criminal, they are the one making sure that that crime is paid. And it's not a fine being paid to the state, it's a fine being paid to the person who is wronged, because that's what biblical restitution teaches us. And so that state is the minister of the sword. They're not the minister of mercy like the church is. So it should be those first 2 spheres, the family and the church, who are the ones taking care of the orphan, the widow, the poor, the downtrodden, all of that. The family is giving money out of their own means to help those people. And they're also giving money to their church, and their elders and deacons take some of the church's money and then make sure that people in the church or in the community that are in need are taken care of. The government doesn't do that. The government helps establish justice and help the poor and widow by punishing wrongdoers, by biblically punishing criminals. So sure, in one sense, the state does help the widow if someone is breaking a law to be unjust to her by punishing the lawbreaker, but the state doesn't give that widow money so she can make rent this month. The church or the family does that.
That's a crucial distinction, because right now, it's especially in society today, all those offices, all of those responsibilities are on our civil government, or at least that's the way they're moving, if they have not already moved there, right? And so I think God's law helps us round out society by putting clear lines, clear distinctions in between the roles between those different realms. And I think it's really important. One of the other things, the reasons why I think that this passage is not, should not be applied to civil government is because later on in Deuteronomy, so specifically Deuteronomy 16:9, it says, in reference to this same tithe, this same amount, it says, you are to count off 7 weeks from the time you first put the sickle to the standing grain. So when you go out to harvest your grain, count 7 weeks, and you shall celebrate the Feast of Weeks to the Lord your God with a free will offering that you give in proportion to how the Lord your God has blessed you. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God in the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name. You, your sons and daughters, your men servants, your maid servants, and the Levite within your gates, as well as the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widows among you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and carefully follow these statutes. So he mentions giving the free will offering. And I know us Calvinists are, our little blinkers are going off. But the idea is that it's not forced. It's not a forced thing, right? The person, God, who is levying these taxes, not forcing you to do this. It's not a do this or you get the sword kind of thing, which would be something that the civil government should be doing, bearing the sword, right? As we see in Romans 13, right? And so this idea that it's a free will giving, you give it to this specific context, right? All of these things taken into consideration gives us reason to believe that this is not a civil government thing. It's an ecclesiastical thing, okay? Now, that's the main passage that we're looking at. But there's also another passage that other commentators have highlighted, which is in Exodus 30, which references this head tax. And so I don't know, I guess I can read it, or if you want to read it, I can read it, and then Jeremy, you can jump in with any comments. So Exodus 30 says, the Lord also spoke to Moses saying, and this is verse 11. The Lord also spoke to Moses saying, when you take a census of the sons of Israel to number them, then each one of them shall give a ransom for himself to the Lord when you number them, so that there will be no plague among them when you number them. This is what everyone who is numbered shall give, half a shekel according to the shekel of the sanctuary. The shekel is 20, I don't know how to pronounce it, geraz?
That sounds good.
Half a shekel as a contribution to the Lord. Everyone who is numbered from 20 years old and over shall give the contribution to the Lord. The rich shall not pay more, and the poor shall not pay less than half the shekel. When you give the contribution to the Lord to make atonement for yourselves, you shall take the atonement money from the sons of Israel and shall give it to the service of the tent of meeting. So there's the purpose, that it may be a memorial for the sons of Israel before the Lord to make an atonement for yourselves. Okay. What are the key points there, Jeremy? What sticks out to you?
Oh, that we actually see not a flat tax rate, a flat tax period. The rich shall not pay. It's not the rich shall not pay more than 10%, and the poor shall not pay less than 10%. It's the rich shall not pay more than half a shekel, and the poor shall not pay less than half a shekel. It is a flat amount, not a flat percentage here, which is where I've heard some people say they think a biblical idea wouldn't even be a flat tax rate. It would be a flat tax amount, period.
That would be great. And it would have to be low, because a flat tax amount would disproportionately affect the poor, right? You would if you set it too high, you're just going to make more impoverished people, right? So it'd have to be low.
And if the government is merely the bearer of the sword, the minister of the sword, as Romans 13 says, and kind of the one over the army when a time to go to war is necessary, not having a standing army all the time just because, then we really wouldn't need a ton of revenue for the government. So they could handle a low flat tax rate, a low flat tax period, a low head tax, and be fine.
Yeah. And that's a good point that you bring up, because the whole army thing, because so a lot of commentators point to the fact that this was based on a census. So it's primarily for the purposes of an army, right? Defense. But it was gathered for a ecclesiastical Levitical purpose. So it's like, if there's an army, you collect this atonement, to be held by the church or the priests. That was kind of the relationship there. Some commentators have actually pointed to this passage as a reason that, or I guess a legitimate form of civil government taxation, because later on in the Old Testament, David restates this. But I kind of have a problem with that because I think the whole purpose of David doing that was to show that he was taking up these offices of like priest and king. This whole idea that you have throughout the Old Testament of these key figures taking up this one or two of these roles of prophet, priest, and king, never all three until Jesus. So as a David, it's like he's taking up a couple different offices, but he never completely gets all three. He's never all three. But he's just like basically a forerunner of Jesus. He's foreshadowing Jesus, right? And so you'll see him use this tax in the office of king for the purposes of worship or whatever. So I think that's what's going on there, and not specifically a prescription for how taxation should be done by the civil government. I think that's more of how we should think of that, and not a prescription for here's what the government should be doing. The other thing I wanted to point out from this passage was that I think 4 or 5 times it has this phrase, as a contribution to the Lord. It repeats that phrase 4 times, I think, in 5 verses. So that's important. That's the purpose of this whole tax thing. It's for God. It's for the Lord, as a contribution to the Lord. So that there again, the distinction between civil government and an ecclesiastical one. Yeah. You have anything else about that passage?
Actually,
a lot of scripture. There's a lot of scripture in this episode. Anyways, go ahead.
Going back a bit, I was thinking one objection we might get is, how would we have things like libraries then and stuff like that? And libraries are a good thing, but I use my local library a lot. But there's a sense in which libraries are almost like socialism light. But the passage before this one in Exodus, we were talking about free will offerings. And I think we could really see stuff like libraries, things like that are good for society, be done by free will offerings. It could be like, if I'm some rich multimillionaire and I recognize the statistics that libraries are a net good from society, you see, kids that have their library card at 10 years old and use it typically go on to be above average in income as adults and things like that. Then I may say, hey, libraries are good. I'm going to put $1 million towards a library and try to get some other people to help with it as well. And then the library could be totally privately funded and probably much more efficient in how it's run, because everything seems to be run more efficiently when it's a private person rather than the government doing it.
Yeah, especially if I'm like a huge corporation and I want to show my philanthropic, usage of my funds. I'm, giving to a library is probably a good way to show people that we care about our community, right? It's a good advertisement. Joel McDermott's book, Restoring America One County at a Time. No matter what you think about Joel right now, his book is a really good summary of a lot of these concepts, and he goes into some ideas about how you could fund things like fire departments, police departments, ambulance services, all these things that normally people are going to say we couldn't do without the government because we need these things, right? There's good reasons to believe that we can do that, right? My brother's actually a police officer, and he's kind of tossed around this idea about how that actually might be where we're going with all of this upheaval about police officers and law enforcement and all that stuff. And it could act similar to like insurance services in a way. So I think there's ways to think about how we can do that and get these offices more on a private basis rather than for government, as an extension of the government, essentially. But that's a really great book, a really great resource if anyone wants to pick it up. Maybe I'll do a giveaway. Maybe. We'll see. Okay, so the other passage I had in here, which was a famous passage, I don't know if we want to go into it, unless you really want to, Jeremy, you tell me, was I think it's Matthew 17, the give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, give unto God what is God's. Jesus's famous passage about giving the tax to Caesar or to God.
Yeah, the passage that's used to justify whatever tax rate Caesar feels like demanding of us.
Yeah, exactly. If Caesar wants 100%, well, got to do it, right?
And that's the mentality when they talk about what tax rate, like there is things like with the Laffer, am I pronouncing that right?
Laffer curve, yeah.
Yeah, with right? that like, there's a curve with tax, and at a certain point, lowering taxes can actually boost government revenue because taxes are a disincentive to business. And so there's all these talks with Republicans and Democrats both. It's not like it's just a Democrat thing about, these different tax rates, 30% versus 28%, and all these other debates they have. But when they debate all that stuff, they're acting like 100% belongs to them, and whatever they allowed this individual to keep is the government being nice. That money belongs to the individual, not the government.
That is an awesome point, because we are going to get into that, because again, it's the jurisdiction. Who has the authority, right? Who is ultimately God? Who's the authority that has claim over these things? Which I think is a way we should be thinking about a lot of this stuff, because when we start talking about these taxes, it seems like the government has the assumption that it belongs to them, and if they can generously give breaks as like a gift, tax breaks like that, like that's a gift to you, like, because the assumption is it's mine. So if I give you a break, that's not. We need a reframing. That's not how it should be. Anyways, so yeah, we'll get into that. But did you want to kind of dig into that, or do you think it's? I'm trying to think, because a lot of that passage, I mean, commentators have tried to, take their best stab at it. There's a lot of speculation, I think. Yeah, or at least from what I've studied, I don't know. It's just a tough passage. It's a tough passage.
Yeah, I'll leave that up to you if we dive into that in this episode or not. We're already going on half an hour, so I don't know what your thoughts on time are.
Yeah, we'll skip over that. Maybe we'll do that. Maybe we'll do something later where we can kind of briefly dig into that. Yeah, let's do that. We'll skip that. But just know the Matthew passage, Jesus's words about give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, give unto God's what is God's. Yeah, we'll talk about that later, because that's another passage that people go to. Let's see. So one thing I wanted to hit on, because it'll be important as we talk about these taxes. The Bible's idea of government is a federalized system, right? It's a there's a headship idea throughout the layers of government, right? You have representatives of people being representations to higher levels of authority. There's this federalized system which should be intact and should stay intact, as we're talking about, theonomy or taxing. So, for instance, in a biblical society, federal government should not be able to tax the individual. Okay, federal government should only be able to deal with the states themselves. Taxation, like they can only tax the states. The states should only be able to tax the counties, and if in wherever it's applicable, states or counties should only be able to tax townships or municipalities. And every one of those steps should not jump over any other step. You have to deal with the most local, the most immediate authority above you. So the individual should only ever be accountable to their county or their municipality as it relates to taxation. Right?
That would do so much towards the point of Matt Turella's book, The Doctrine of the Lesser Magistrate.
Oh,
Are you familiar with that?
I am. I've not read it yet, but it is on my list. Yeah. I didn't know he talked about that in that book.
Well, it just really gets towards his idea of when a higher magistrate does make some kind of iniquitous law, the lower magistrate is the one that's supposed to stop it. And I think that would just get us more towards you don't have a whole lot of in between the county and the federal government, the individual and the federal government. It's really just working with the level directly above and directly below you, which I think would help towards what he talks about in that book.
Okay. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
one thing you were just saying that I think was kind of hinted at, I don't know how many people would have caught it, but the way you were talking about the federal government sounded almost covenantal. And that's because federal and covenantal are basically synonymous terms with each other. There's a reason why, 1689 federalism, that's the term for Reformed Baptist covenant theology, and it's called federalism because federalism and covenantalism are basically synonymous. So,
Mhm.
in a sense, we could say the federal government is the covenantal government.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, me and the co-host of this show are actually going to do an episode on that and the covenantal framework that republicanism is based on, or it should be based on. Just having the layers of authority and representation throughout the government, which forces individuals to be more involved in their community, right? Their
Mhm.
immediate community, and not super involved in who's going to be president of the United States, right? Which I think would solve a lot of our issues. A lot of our issues right now are just people getting all up in arms about the federal government, where they have the least say, and disregarding the place where they have the most, bang for their buck in their
Yeah.
political endeavors.
I mean,
So
in last year's election, when it came to the local stuff, how many spots were there where you didn't get a choice for that position because only one person was running? It wasn't like,
right,
here's the Democrat, here's the Republican, here's the Libertarian, here's another third party. It was, oh, this one guy is the only one. So it doesn't matter the political party, whether or not you agree with them. You have to vote for them because there's no other options because no one else ran.
yeah, exactly, yeah, yeah. And it's going to take. I mean, this is not something that's going to happen overnight, right? It's something that will come gradually, as
Mhm.
us confident postmillennialists
Yeah.
will say that we're going that way. We're going to get there. It's just
Mhm.
a matter of getting there. Leaven slowly fills the lump of dough, right? The seed slowly grows into a large tree. You've got all this agricultural imagery going on, but let's talk about different types of taxation. I think we've established that the civil government does not have the authority for taxation. Right now, as it is, maybe we can ask the question, what would it look like as we're moving towards a more just society where the civil government does not have that authority? What are there any forms of taxation that may be permissible? Are there some that are just downright not permissible at all? Let's just
Mhm.
discuss. So I have a list of them, and we'll just kind of run through them real quick. So sales tax, for instance, I think this may be the most possibly permissible, just because it's got a voluntary nature. You decide whether or not you pay it based on whether you buy the product or not. It still provides. It still has an uneven burden on lower classes because certain commodities that you have to buy for living, right? It's just basically a flat fee. It increases the cost of those products for lower class people.
Yeah. There are a
Um,
lot of states that have things like no sales tax on food or medicine, and things like that are helpful. But even that
yeah,
kind of has the assumption of the government deserves this. And there's aren't they so nice to you that when you buy a bag of apples at the store, you don't have to pay sales tax on them?
yeah. You get don't you love that you get a reduction? We're not taking that increased portion. We're giving it back to you.
Mhm.
Yeah. So sales tax, maybe I think it would still increase. Like if we're talking about this federalized system, it would states would still have to report accurate, sales to the federal government, which um, makes it so that you need record keeping, which record keeping is a cost in of itself, which will increase the cost as well. So you've got a lot of intricacies there, where it's like it's not ideal. It's just not ideal. Um, yeah. So sales tax, maybe. Property tax. What do you think, Jeremy?
I think essentially property tax means you don't actually own property in America. The government just lets you pay for it and then rent it from them.
Exactly. Someone, I have a note on here. Property tax, aka feudal dues.
Yeah.
So it's basically feudalism. It's the government has a claim on godhood. Whose stuff is it ultimately, right? And so that's why we think property tax is an absolute no. It's not the government stuff. God says in Deuteronomy 10:14 that all things belong to him. What else? I think one of the Psalms says the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Everything is his. Property tax, no.
I think property tax oftentimes goes to pay towards public schools. And there's another entire conversation we won't get into because it's so off track. But Doug Wilson has some good articles and podcast episodes and books about that, and he's not the only one.
Yeah. Property tax. I think that's the general assumption. Property taxes for schooling. Yeah, that's not. Not something prescribed by the civil government either. Anyways, all right. So estate tax and the gift tax, I think those go hand in hand. And I was doing some research on these. The estate tax essentially is it's basically an attack on the command to leave a legacy for your children, right? That's your show's whole thing.
Yeah,
right?
That's like the tagline verse of my show.
Yeah, leave a legacy for your children. And I think it says your children and your children's children, right?
Yeah, leaving an inheritance for your children's children, which comes from Proverbs chapter 13.
Yep. And that's something that we are required to do. But what the estate tax does is it says, again, that the government has claim over those things. And you should not be able to hand down your stuff to your children without the government getting a portion of it, right? And you know what I thought was the most insidious thing ever, which I did not know? The gift tax is actually, it was designed for the purpose of covering loopholes in the estate tax.
Really?
So what people would do when they knew they were about to die or pass away, they would gift this thing. So it wasn't a transaction. It wasn't a transfer of wealth. It was a gift to someone, right? So they would give their stuff away and then die, and it wouldn't be subject to the inheritance tax. And so the gift tax was the government saying, you can't do that. It's like plug in the hole. You can't do that. If you give a gift now, we're going to tax it.
Yeah,
so,
I knew of the gift tax. I didn't know that was the purpose behind it.
Yeah,
that's crazy.
I didn't either. It's a reaction to to people trying to get around these loopholes, which is a theme with the government. It's like all these corporations and even individuals find these creative ways to get around the laws that the government set themselves to legally get by, these tax laws. And it's just an infinite, it's just like an infinite chase to plug all these holes. And you've got, and the tax code just keeps stacking up because you're plugging all the holes everywhere.
But they need to leave loopholes in there for themselves. They just need to make them so complicated. You need these, $10,000 an hour or something like that lawyers to do it for you.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Something interesting with that related to the estate tax. Last December, when Cruciform Ministries put on the post-mill virtual conference, Jared Sparks did a session of it, and he was talking about when he was younger, before he was post-mill and all that, he was thinking that, if he basically dies dirt poor because he just gave everything away at the end, that would be like his goal. And then after he became post-mill, he started looking at more verses like from Proverbs 13, the tagline of my podcast. He was saying, oh no, I actually should try to die wealthy. That way I have money to pass on to my kids and grandkids and maybe even great grandkids. And this has really changed my perspective. And I private messaged him after the conference and said, I was asking him, but what do you think though? Maybe we should try to die, quote unquote, dirt poor, but it's because you already gave that money to your kids and grandkids before you died. That way the government wouldn't get to take their inheritance away from them. And then he agreed with that. He said, actually, yeah, I didn't go into that in the talk, but that would be my goal. When I know I'm going to die soon, I don't have a lot of time left to try to give away a lot of money. But because of this, I think it's $10K a year is when it kicks in. You kind of have to think of that several years in advance. If you wanted to give, $25K to each kid or something like that, you'd have to do like $8K a year for a few years or something like that leading up to it.
Yeah. And if you run out before then, you could just go live with your kids or something.
Hmm.
um, yeah. And yeah, so many side trails we could go on, but for the sake of time, I'll cut it off there. Um, capital gains tax. I think it's immoral. It's the government saying we have a claim on basically the increase in how much people want your stuff, the demand for your product, essentially. Capital gains tax, for those who don't know, you put an investment into maybe the stock market, right? It rides up and increases in value. When you take it out of the stock market, it's taxable. That increase is taxable. And so it's basically just a tax on the increase. It's a tax on the increase of how much people wanted, the demand for your stuff, which is like, I don't care if they want it more than they did a month ago. It's mine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
It's
that
just
gets us
immoral.
I guess into another thing we shouldn't talk about now, but like the difference between a regular IRA and a Roth IRA and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Yeah, capital gains tax. Wealth tax, again, immoral. You cannot just tax people's stuff. I think it's similar to a property tax. Plus, how do you define wealth? I think that's one of the big issues. If you can't define it, you can't tax it. And a lot of people have different definitions of what wealth is. Like, for instance, Elon Musk, they want to tax all of his wealth, but his wealth is in SpaceX and all these other things like Tesla and their stock. It's not money. They think he has like billions of dollars sitting in a bank account somewhere. No, he doesn't.
Yeah, there's a huge difference between net worth and liquid assets. What does Elon Musk have to give the government one rocket for every 10 he builds or something?
Right. And I think even Bezos he only paid like a couple million each year, like 12 million or something like that each year. It's not like he's getting billions of dollars each year. His wealth is in Amazon. Are we going to liquidate Amazon so that you can get your tax money? Right? Amazon's providing way better services than the government would ever do with that money. So
yeah, this is also a punishment on people who use their money wisely. Like if myself and another guy, all things being equal, we make the same, let's say me and another guy make 100K a year. We have this, we're both married. We have the same number of kids. So essentially we could have the same expenses, but I'm at 100K a year income, living in a 200K house. I don't really take extravagant vacations. This guy is doing, living in a house over twice the value of mine, doing a fancy week-long cruise every year and all this stuff. And, I'm basically putting quite a big chunk of change in the bank every year, and he's barely breaking even at the end of the year. Why should 20 years later a wealth tax gets instituted and now I have to give the government 20 grand for my wealth tax and he doesn't have to give them any because I was smart with my same amount of money that he had?
Right. Yeah, it incentivizes. I think anytime you're thinking about economics, you got to think about the incentives that certain policies create for people. I think a lot of our government officials don't do that. They just think about what revenue is going to be increased or what the immediate result's going to be, and not the trade-off or the incentive that it sets up. I think is super important. Jeremy, you are getting married.
Yeah,
right?
hopefully sometime next year.
So are you and your fiance right now looking at housing situation or anything like that?
I already own a house, so we won't have to worry about that.
Oh, okay. I was going to ask you if this whole inflation thing was causing any issues with like housing prices and things being way too expensive, which they are, but I don't know if it was something that you were personally experiencing right now.
Yeah, I bought my house a year and a half ago, right before everything happened with COVID. And I think the value of my house with all this stuff has already gone up like 10 or 20 grand just in the last year
Wow.
of the year and a half.
That was good timing.
Yeah, I know. It was like God's providence. There was no way I could have seen coming what was going to happen in the first 2 months of owning my home.
Yeah. And the reason I brought that up is because inflation is also a tax, so to speak. It's a hidden tax, right? Government gets the opportunity to have funds today for the cost of your increased prices tomorrow. That's
Mhm.
essentially what it is. So they get to pay down their debts at today's prices while your prices are going up tomorrow at the expense of your prices going
Yeah.
up.
There's one
So
thing I will say about inflation. It's at least a flat tax. Like of all the corrupt taxes out there, it's less corrupt than a progressive tax rate. Because if the government's going to increase the progressive tax rate to pay off its debts, that's punishing the rich for having more money, essentially. At least if they just print money to pay it off, then everyone gets the inflation, quote unquote, tax equally.
right,
So it's at least a flat tax rate.
right. But it would also still affect poor people disproportionately
Yeah, it
because
would.
commodities are gonna go up and all that. But
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah, like
it's
sorry.
no, go ahead.
Like David Bonson's recently said that he basically hasn't noticed how much gas has gone up in the last year because to people in his tax bracket, $2 or $3 a gallon for gas is almost meaningless.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. David Bonson is a wealthy Christian, just for
Yeah.
those who don't know.
And son of Greg Bonson, who was a
And
huge proponent of theonomy.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, good tie-in. Great, awesome. Okay, so and then the global minimum tax. There's a whole bunch of talk about that right now. There's just some kind of waffling back and forth. I think I saw an article last week that said that they had gotten a whole bunch of nations to sign on to agree to this global minimum tax, which would be like a floor of 15%
Mhm.
taxation on corporations that operate outside of their home nation. Which, if you can't get everyone on board, all you're going to do is just force corporations to go to these nations that are not going to accept it or not going to play by these rules.
Yeah. And in a theoretical framework where they got everyone on board, what this would lead to people doing is moving to another nation where it's easy to get citizenship and the taxes aren't that bad, and then renouncing American citizenship, which in itself is a huge, long, difficult, and expensive process. But it's going to lead to people moving away and then renouncing their American citizenship because as long as you're still an American citizen, you still have to pay this tax. So they renounce their American citizenship to get around paying this
Oh yeah,
15%.
yeah, yeah. And um, the other thing I was thinking about for this one, the global minimum tax, was that China has decided that they are on board. But I'm like, China has never uh, stayed consistent with their agreements in the past, like the Paris Accords. They don't abide by the Paris Accords, even though they're signed on as people who are for it. They don't
Mhm.
care. They just want to get the competitive upper hand. I think the same thing would happen with this one. You say you're good with it, but you would give the tax breaks. You would not have it apply to your specific organizations. Um, yeah, which would shift the burden over to China's competitors because they're staying consistent with it and applying that 15% minimum tax. Yeah, it's I think it's a bunch of junk. Also, the other thing I was thinking was like, okay, a lot of these politicians that are that are proponents of this global minimum tax are also people who don't want a wall at the
Mhm.
southern border, which I don't know if I do either. I don't, that's a whole different discussion. Um, but a global minimum tax is essentially a wall. It's
Mhm.
a systematic wall. Don't you leave. You better not leave because everywhere else we're setting up fences everywhere else so that you don't are not incentivized to leave us and take your tax money elsewhere.
Mhm.
Yeah. All right. I think that was it for the taxation piece.
Yeah, I think one thing kind of putting that all together a bit is we definitely saw several forms of taxation that we said this is unjust, this is wrong, this is not in accordance with scripture. But there were others where there was a little bit, I think, of room for disagreement while still agreeing with scripture. And all that to say, it's not like theonomy is this monolithic thing where everyone agrees on every single point. I think if we had multiple nations in the world that were truly theonomistic, we could actually see differences in tax rates between them, differences in some laws between them based on understandings. And that doesn't mean that the one nation has to go to war with the other nation over their different understanding at the national level of a certain aspect of theonomy. I think, being post mill, one day there will be multiple theonomic nations, and they might have slightly different laws based on different understandings.
Yeah, and one thing you'll learn as you study theonomy is the leeway that the law does give for, like,
Mhm.
for instance, like freedom of worship is a big thing in theonomy. Like, if in a theonomic nation you would have allowances for people worshiping as they please. And Jeremy, you correct me if I'm wrong because you're more studied on this than I am, but the whole separation of church and state thing is a scriptural thing, right? We talked
Yeah,
about the
that gets into the spheres of authority. Today, we
yeah,
think the separation of church and state means that the state is a secular, atheistic institution and the church is religious. It originally meant that the church is one institution under God, it's one sphere of authority, and the state's another institution also under God, another sphere of authority.
yeah, separation of church and state, not separation of God and state.
Yeah.
So so God's law allows for these differences while also having that unity in Christ, right? The whole thing is about God's law, God's rule over the world, over the nations. So yeah, get plugged in with a lot of different resources on theonomy. I think you'll be
Mhm.
really blessed by it. Last thing I wanted to point out was, Jeremy, you're a business guy? You do have business background, right?
Yeah, I have a degree, a bachelor's in business and an associate's in accounting, and I work at a nonprofit.
Okay, so you do have an associate's in accounting. So you have the concept of segregation of duties in your head. You know what that is. Separation of duties, as it relates to controls and all that stuff. Um, so separation of duties is essentially the idea that certain functions within an organization should not share certain roles. They should not have say over two of the same roles. You have to have them segregated. So, for instance, custody over cash and assets should not be in the same hands as the person who's record keeping.
Mhm.
Right? You should not have those two together. No organization is going to have those together. Treasury function and the accounting function in any organization are separate. Right? You've got that segregation of duties. You do not want collusion, any of that.
Yeah, it's accountability.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one thing that someone pointed out, which I thought was really fascinating, was that in our day and age, the government has both the authority to levy taxes and to punish for levying taxes. So basically,
Mm.
requiring it and punishing for not doing it. So, thing I have here is segregation of duties, which suggests that we wouldn't put the power of the purse and the power of the sword in the same hand. Yeah, civil government should not have both, and they do. They do.
Yeah.
And it should
There's
not be the case.
Yeah, there's a reason why churches, nonprofits, all of that have rules like when you're opening the checks that come in as donations and counting the cash and stuff like that, you need 2 or 3 people, actually a biblical concept there,
Two or
all
three
opening it
witnesses, yeah.
together. Yeah, you don't want just one guy counting the cash that came into your church in the offering plate on Sunday morning and being the one reporting it, because he could say that you got $100 and you actually got 300. It's accountability. But with the
Yeah.
government, when they're the one making the law and enforcing the law on taxation, they can kind of make whatever the law they want and then throw you in prison if you don't
Mhm.
obey it. Although, like one of my teachers had said back in middle school, if taxes are 1/3 right now, what happens when they make taxes 2/3 and people stop paying them? Are you going to throw the only people paying taxes in prison? Then what? Now, how do you pay for prisons?
Right. Exactly. That's right. You should do so I have some ideas. I would love to hear you do an episode on prison first,
Mhm.
but also on the immigration issue. I think that'd be really good.
I already have some thoughts on stuff with prison. Immigration will be a whole thing. I've thought about it a little bit as it's been debated. I'd have to think more
Yeah.
about that. But
Yeah.
prison, I'm pretty against the idea because I think if you look at the Bible, it's mostly restitution.
Yep.
And the only jails are short term holding someone on a sentence of capital punishment.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Capital punishment has to be on the table
Yeah.
in theonomic law. I think there's a lot of leeway given to, like, the victims to
Mhm.
bestow mercy, those types of things, but it's not the government's role to bestow mercy. So yeah, man, I'm excited about what you're doing with your podcast. I'm really excited to see what, the topics that you're going to tackle, and, how you're, gearing people to think about economics and justice in a theonomic way, bringing it to people to kind of like in bite-sized pieces. So it's not like you have to tackle a Van Tillian or a Rushduni book, right at the outset, just kind of giving it piecemeal, which I think is really, really helpful.
I love what you're doing. I've been listening to your podcast for over a year now, actually, since before Theonomoney was even an idea.
That's awesome. That gives you a little pep in your step and a flame under you. So just to close out, in summary, taxes should only be on net income, should be under 10%. If we're going the route of taxation now, in the civil government, only net income under 10%, individual only tax at the most local level possible. There would be a federalized system, which would mean that the federal government could not reach down and tax you as the individual. Can you imagine your pay statement not having state tax or federal tax listed on it? That'd be awesome.
That would be great. You only see the city tax. Yeah, like what you were saying. I only pay taxes to the city. The city pays taxes to the county to the state, and the state to the federal government.
Yep. That would be awesome. That would be great. And then it would be full, and then any taxation to the federal government or the civil government would be the bare minimum for the administration of justice, right? Or the administration of retributive justice, not justice in the sense like you were saying, mercy ministries, or any sort of things that would be the responsibility of the church, specifically for bearing the sword, as Romans 13 says.
Yeah, and that may even free up politicians to have more bivocational politicians, which would mean there would be even less of an expense on there.
And less, they would have less conflict of interest in their political duties, right? They wouldn't be bound by corporations to provide them their money and all that stuff.
Yeah, like I live in Indiana. If you're in the state House of Representatives or a senator at the state level, not in DC representing Indiana, but the state level, you're only in session 2 months out of the year, and they pay you maybe like 20 grand for it. So those other 10 months of the year, you're going to be doing something else to make more than 20 grand over the course of the year. So all those guys there are bivocational, and they're a bivocational politician. And I think that's good. It keeps them connected to the average person that they're supposed to be there to represent.
Yeah. That's awesome. I didn't know that. That's pretty cool. All right, man. Well, like I said, everyone, go check out the Theonomoney podcast, like and subscribe. I think you're on Spotify, and are you on iHeart? What was it? iHeart Radio?
I'm trying to get on iHeart and Apple soon. I'm not yet. Yeah, I just recently found out that iHeart Radio has more podcast downloads than Apple or Spotify, and that blew my mind when I found that out. I thought for sure Apple and Spotify would be 1 and 2.
Exactly. I need to get on there as well. So Spotify, everyone go subscribe, leave a comment, rate and review on Theonomoney. Do the same thing for Christ in Capital. That'd be great. But yeah, Jeremy, thank you so much for coming on. Like I said, I think what you're doing is awesome. It's going to really bless the church. So thank you for what you're doing. Any last words, anything you want to say before we sign off?
I think you said a lot. Thank you. And thank you for what you do with Christ in Capital.
All right, everybody. Well, like we always say, until next time, go love God, love neighbor, and build something. Talk to you later.